All right, time for another episode of Random Thoughts from Crazed Mind, the worst video channel on YouTube. And today I'm going to be talking about what the concept of all men are created equal actually means. All men are created equal. What does that mean? Now, I don't have cable anymore, so I watch a lot of documentaries on YouTube and watch a number of historical I'm basically always watching historical documentaries. So I've been watching a lot of documentaries and reading different things about those times over the past few years, and I've pieced together what all of this, what um, what that concept actually meant versus what we want it to mean or what we kind of propagandized it to mean with our history, which is all history is basically BS. So when you look at the founding of the United States, you have to look at what the founding fathers actually were. I mean, think about what kind of a government would we have today if we had Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates. If these were the guys that we decided to create our government, what kind of a country would we have today? Because that's exactly what was going on back then, and that's exactly the kind of country that they were creating. All of the founding fathers were extremely wealthy. These were the wealthiest men in America. John Hancock was literally the wealthiest man in America, I believe. Benjamin Franklin was one of the wealthiest men in America, very large landowner. Thomas Jefferson was a very large landowner. George Washington was the largest distiller of whiskey in the colonies. Exceptionally wealthy man. He was married to the wealthiest woman in the United States from the Custis family. Married her for her money, actually. You look at the history of George Washington, he was a climber. He was always looking to move up the social ladder. And even when he was wealthy, he was always trying to perfect his manners and be a gentleman and be respected in elite society. And so all of these guys were really wealthy. And so people want to say that they were trying to create a democratic country, which was exactly the opposite of what they were doing. What all men are created equal was a justification for breaking away from the king. It was a justification for where their rights came from, because these guys were really loyal subjects of the British Crown. They wanted to live under the king, but they were becoming exceptionally wealthy, and they did not like being taxed. No taxation without representation. The whole American Revolution was about taxes. Imagine that. Wealthy people did not want to pay taxes, right? It all came from the Stamp Act, all this from the British Crown trying to tax the American colonies. And the whole revolution was really a minor league operation. The British reason that America became independent was because the British didn't really care about the colonies. They thought it was just a waste of time. They thought they could put this thing down easy enough. It was a minor thing. They never really even understood why they were revolting in. They couldn't understand what they were so upset about. I mean, we run the colonies. We can do what we want to do. This is just a little tax. I mean, what are these people even complaining about? They just never got it. And that was when they just let it go. They just didn't care. It wasn't worth fighting for. They put up a little bit of a fight, but ultimately they're just like, nah, we'll just give them what they want, and we'll get things back eventually. So one of the things that we're not taught in school, like I learned that half the people in the United States were loyalists, and I always wondered, well, how did they get half the people in the United States to, if it was 50-50, how did it go towards the revolution? Well, the reason it went towards the revolution is because it had a civil war. The American Revolution was actually a civil war, and the Americans weren't fighting the British military. They were in some cases, but the British military was basically organizing the loyalists in America, and this was exactly like the Civil War. You had American loyalists were fighting the revolutionaries. It was Americans against Americans. And the reason that the loyalists were able to, or the reason that the revolutionists were able to turn over, to take the whole country, was because they won the Civil War, So, I mean, when you have the Civil War and you lose, you get the whole thing. So, once the British moved out, then they had power to take over the whole country, even though half the country wanted to stay under the king, were loyalists, and were actually fighting for the king. So anyway, getting back to all men are created equal. Now, when we think about the Declaration of Independence, we give ourselves credit for creating this new government and for creating the ideas of equality and all that sort of stuff. And the founding fathers themselves were not the originators of these ideas. They got these ideas from the Enlightenment, from Enlightenment philosophy. These guys all read philosophy. They were all self-educated, more or less. They had libraries, and they read this European philosophy about where rights, basically about how the world should be structured, came from European revolutionist philosophy thinking, which was the Enlightenment. Separation of church and state came from the Enlightenment. All these ideas came from the Enlightenment. You can read about the Enlightenment, and it's right down the line was what these our American founding fathers were following, those guidelines of how you organize society. So when they said all men are created equal, what they were actually doing was creating the justification for their own power. They were not saying all men are literally created equal. This was a term of propaganda. This was a rhetorical argument for where your rights came from. Because what the American founding fathers were upset about was that they weren't being given their rights as British citizens by the crown. They felt that their rights were being stomped on. In fact, George Washington literally compared himself to one of his own slaves. He said, we're being treated as slaves. We're being treated as blacks. He didn't say that because, his rights weren't being honored. Or he was saying it because his rights weren't being honored, but he wasn't saying it because all men are created equal. That was the exact opposite of what he believed. His British rights weren't being honored. He wanted his rights. He wanted these guys were exceptionally wealthy. They were like, okay, we can run this thing ourselves now. We don't really need the king interfering. We're happy subjects of the king, but look, we've got a lot of money and we should be running things. And that was ultimately why they said all men are created equal. When they said all men are created equal, that meant that they were equal to the king. It didn't mean that you are equal to the king. It means that they were equal to the king, because all men are created equal. Our rights come from God, basically, right? That's, you're born with these rights. You get these rights when you're born. They gave credit to God. Now, they didn't literally believe that God gave them their rights. Their basic argument was all men are created equal. You get your rights from, not from the king. You get your rights from just organizing society yourself. You can have your own rights. All men are created equal. We are equal to the king. We can govern ourselves because all men are created equal, and that is self-evident. We get these rights when we're born. That's self-evident. Right? This is science. The Enlightenment was about science. It was about having a government based on reason. This was a reasoned argument. All men are created equal. We don't need the king. That's what all men are created equal. It doesn't mean that they were equal to the slave. It doesn't mean that non-landowners were equal. That is exactly what it doesn't mean. It means that the founding fathers were equal to the king, and they were able to govern themselves because they were the representatives of the country. All men are created equal. We can govern this country ourselves, and we will govern it for you as well, because we're the elected leaders. Now, the problem was that the only people who could vote were the people that owned land, and they were the landowners. And so, when they said all men are created equal, all that meant was landowners are equal to the king. That's all that it meant. That's all that it's ever meant. All men are created equal. We, as landowners, are equal to the king. We can govern ourselves because our rights come from nature. They come from God. And that is self-evident. Right? That is a philosophical argument. It's a rhetorical argument. It's an argument of propaganda. This is where our rights come from. It's the justification for the revolution. It's not literal. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's figurative. All men are created equal. It's a political statement. It's not meant to be that blacks are ever going to be equal. It's not meant to mean that people who don't own land are equal. Now, it's the people who are in charge that are equal to the king. That's who's equal. And so, there's not any inconsistency in that statement when they say all men are created equal. They said, people talk about, well, they were so hypocritical, they were so racist. No, they weren't. That's not what it meant. All men are created equal means our rights are self-evident. We are equal to the king. We don't need a king. We're the landowners of this society. We are equal to the king. We can govern ourselves. That is self-evident. That is a political argument for breaking away from the king, because half the country are loyalists. You're speaking to the loyalist. You're saying, we don't get our rights from the king. We get our rights from ourselves. We can govern ourselves. We don't need the king to tell us what to do, because we are equal to the king. That's what all men are created equal means. This has been another video from Random Thoughts from a Crazy Mind, the worst video channel on YouTube. So long, YouTube.